Good morning, everybody. If those outside can come in and take their seats, we'll start directly. It's been a wonderful week already. We've only had 2 days. It might seem to you that it's been a bit longer, but we've packed so much in and the organisation has been so good that we've experienced a lot, I think, in a short period of time. So once again, congratulations to Portugal and to the hosts that have been organising this wonderful conference for us. On Tuesday, we talked about the problem, and we know the problem. We talked about the shape of it, the size of it, the scope of it, the complexity. We know that. On Wednesday, yesterday, we started talking about integrated fire management, and we know that too. We know the scope of it, we know some discussions of it, some definition of it, and there's some discussion about definition, but broadly it's accepted and understood. We know its shape. We saw some applications of it, we saw some examples and some tools and methods of how it's used. And today we move on to the next step, to the big step, to risk governance. And I don't really think we know what that is. I don't think we've understood it. We know some things about risk. We can frame some sources of risk, some agents of risk, some motivations for risk being created. At community level, and in some places we've been able to work with or understand or formulate governance as an approach to risk, but I don't think we know it. Given all that we do know, what the problem is, how to integrate fire and management, 5 Rs, methods, approaches, remote sensing, data, tools and equipment, which we can see downstairs, approaches. We have a lot of things in practice, and so the problem we're here to talk about, wildland fires, we shouldn't really have the problem because we know so much about the problem and we have applied so much energy and funding over the years and the decades to the problem, so we shouldn't have it. So there's something that's not in our wildland fire mix, and I think the thing that's not in there as strongly as it should be, as much as it should be, is governance and the governance of risk. So the means, the modes, the methods, how we do it, by which we interact, we conduct the dialogue of knowledge, that we connect, we build relationships before formalising processes, I heard that yesterday, and approaches are all part of the process of governance that we need. And today we're going to look at fire risk governance. And our focus, I think, should be up. As I said, for some communities it's a small enough space and a few enough people and actors that you can understand it. You can get your head around it and work out who's doing what. We need to get agencies and governments involved in governance. We need to get them talking with each other and internally. And so today we look towards that sort of country leadership. And to help us do that, we're very, very lucky and fortunate to have an outstanding panel and 2 outstanding speakers. Elisa Ferreira is from the European Commission on Cohesion and Reforms, the Minister, and that title, the Minister of Cohesion and Reform, sounds to me like it's someone, at least will be someone who knows a lot about governance. We also have Ortwin Wren, who's retired from the International Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies, but Ortwin was also one of the key architects and a driver of the International Risk Governance Centre think tank that was set up in Switzerland many years ago. And I'm quite sure that he, of course, would have many, many things to talk to us. We also have on the stage here Toddy Stillman, who is the Stanback Dean at the Nicholas School of Environment at Duke University. So someone who's a dean is obviously managing and governing a very complex organisation in a very large and prestigious university. So I'm sure there's some learned experience as well as some research experience. And of course, our good friend and constant presence, Tiago de Oliveira, who is the president of AGIF and is one of the people who has helped to put this all together. So if I can ask you, Elisa, to come to the podium and present to us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter, and good morning to all of you. Welcome. My special words to the organizers of this important meeting. Special word also to Tiago Oliveira, to the members of this panel, Minister Ana Brunhosa, all the participants, in particular the panelists. Thank you very much for the invitation to address the 8th edition of the International Wildland Fire Conference, and for this opportunity to speak on this absolutely essential and also urgent topic. In fact, I welcome this conference and find it extremely timely. My thanks, in particular, I already did it by naming Tiago, but my thanks to the Portuguese Agency for the integrated management of rural fires, for organizing such a big and relevant event, and to have managed to invite here for this discussion so many relevant stakeholders in the world. It's 1,000 participants, more than 1,000 participants, 100 nationalities, so it is a worldwide issue being addressed by worldwide stakeholders. It is often said that many hands make light work, and I am encouraged by this essential topic being covered by so much expertise. We are witnessing, in fact, all of us, an alarming acceleration of wildfires across the entire world. Recent examples in Europe, but also in Australia, Canada, Brazil, China, Chile, or the United States, they are just a reminder of the global dimension of the problem. And in fact, I think all of us share the concern with the warning by the United Nations that every year 400 million hectares of land are affected by fire, of which 100 million hectares are in forests, which is equivalent to 3% of the world's forest area. This has been happening every single year. The impact of wildfires are multifold, so we don't have to address it, but just recall the relevance of the topic. Of course, starting with the tragic loss of human lives, to the physical and mental health consequences for those exposed to such disasters, the destruction of livelihoods, of the houses, of their lives, of so many communities, the terrible effects for all biomass, the loss of carbon sinks, and the heavy greenhouse gas emissions associated with wildlife fires, the huge economic costs in the order of, it's unbearable to try to make this calculation, but it goes up to hundreds of billions of euros. This used to be a tragedy in slow motion. Now it has accelerated, and it is happening now at a very fast pace. That's why it is so urgent. Despite some recent successes in fire management and suppression, notably in the Mediterranean area, severe weather conditions have been contributing to set new records in terms of number of fires and hectares of damage. Last year was no exception, and this year already we see early warning signs with severe fires already in Spain and France. Drought and water shortages announce a difficult summer, as the drying up of soil moisture can be an igniter of wildlife fires. According to a report from the United Nations Environmental Programme, the UNEP, released last year, the number of wildfires is expected to increase by almost 15% by 2030 and by 30% by 2050. Even areas not normally thought of as fire-prone, such as the Arctic, are at risk. This is in fact an extremely serious threat. Wildfires wreak havoc, hurt nature, hurt lives, hurt the economy. They kill our chances to have a future globally. They represent a complex and multifold challenge, require a multi-level and a multi-pronged approach. The European Commission is part of this wider effort, acting at different levels in close cooperation with our member states. And this is the kind of testimony that I can bring to this discussion. I would precisely address 5 topics, just to illustrate what we are trying to do. European climate law writes into law the goal set out in the European Green Deal for Europe's economy and society to become climate neutral by 2050. And we actually mean it, and member states have confirmed it in internal law, in domestic law. The law also sets the intermediate target of reducing net house gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030 compared to the levels of 1990. Climate neutrality by 2050 means achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions for European countries as a whole, European Union countries as a whole, mainly by cutting emissions, by investing in green technologies, but also by protecting the natural environment through, for instance, sustainable forest management. Secondly, we are working to prevent forest fires. It is known that the bulk of the financial effort still goes to fire suppression. There is no way we can avoid it, but we need to do more at the stages of planning and prevention. This reduces harm before it even happens, as well as being highly efficient, including from a cost perspective. A 2021 report we co-authored with the World Bank found that the benefits of prevention measures range from 2 to 10 times the cost of coming after the damage has done. So it's quite a good investment, also from this more economic perspective. European cohesion policy, and for those that are not familiar with it, cohesion policy in the European Union accounts for more or less 1/3 of the European budget. The European budget is very, very small. It's about 1% of the total wealth of the countries included, the 27 member states, but nevertheless 1/3 of it is allocated to cohesion. And cohesion policy invested 8 billion euros in climate change adaptation and risk prevention in the 2014-2020 programs, just for this topic. We do it through the member states, in partnership with member states. And we plan to invest a further 12.5 billion euros in the period, new financial period. It's 7 years periods for the period of 2021-27. These measures include not just protection against forest fires, but also floods, coastal protection, earthquakes, landslides, erosion, and drought. In each case, we prioritize prevention measures. We have a principle also that we call do no harm to environment. So with the massive investment that is being supported for member states to bring back development, to organize and reorganize their future, economic development and social development, there is this horizontal principle, do it right. That's what we are asking member states to do. We, as I mentioned, we support national authorities in their efforts to provide early warning systems and risk management strategies. We also support those who invest in green infrastructure, including those who retrofit existing infrastructures or structures. And we invest in improving the knowledge base for risk management. In Portugal, to use the example of the host country of this conference, Cohesion policy has supported early warning systems, civil protection, training, and awareness measures to prevent forest fires, as well as active policies such as the creation of forest fire management lanes. And in the new 21-27 programs in Portugal alone, cohesion policy will support protection against wildfires in 1.8 million hectares of land in various places across the country. That is an equivalent to 18 times the size of one of the natural parks that's called Serra da Estrela here. But planning is absolutely key. And this touches upon exactly the topic of this session, so governance, how to organize the system. Also for this, for the quality side of how you make decisions, how you implement them, there is also support from the European Commission. We call it European Technical Support Instrument, so is known by TSI. It's managed by one of the departments that is also under my responsibility, that is the General Directorate of Reforms, the reforms side of my title that you very nicely pointed out to. And this is the instrument that provides tailor-made expertise to member states under their request, their demand, to design and implement reforms. And it has supported the implementation of the Portuguese National Plan for Integrated Wildlife Management. This has started with pilot actions in 3 regions. One is Alto Tâmega, Coimbra, and Western Algarve, along with a set of tools for monitoring and evaluating processes. A follow-up project will be launched to build up capacities, bringing expertise to improve the governance framework for preventing forest fires. These actions are being replicated, and we really want to give it an horizontal dimension across Europe, creating platforms of cooperation to address and to learn from each other when we are faced with the same problem. Excuse me. The technical support instrument is also providing expertise and support to Greece as they improve their fire risk prevention and emergency response, and the instrument will also support risk preparedness and emergency responses in other countries, notably Czechia, Germany, Croatia, and Slovenia. So this is the philosophy, is to share, to learn with each other. At the same time, with the forest fire session approaching, we are also stepping up the other side of our story, the support to member states in fighting the problems when they happen. So we are increasing our preparedness for that. So the third aspect that I would like to address is the efforts that the European Commission is doing to provide support to those who tackle actual forest fires. And we are preparing for the upcoming fire season. A key priority for 2023 is to double the European reserve of planes and helicopters available across Europe under the RESC-EU initiative. In addition, from June onwards, the European Commission's 24/7 Emergency Response Coordination Centre will help coordinate forest fire responses throughout Europe. From a more structural angle, the European cohesion policy is supporting regions massively with the RRP and with cohesion funding. We invest in a lot of programs, projects, so we really want them to bear in mind that you have got to do it with a sensitivity to environment in practical terms when you do the choices. But they also cover, apart from massive investment, response vehicles, systems, and training, particularly in the case of the social fund. But for instance, north of Portugal, together the region of north of Portugal, together with Galicia and Castilla-León in Spain, have developed a cross-border mutual assistance mechanism with this support, which is quite inspirational to manage problems across borders, also in other countries. It has a single operational command, a structure with a single operational command to tackle emergencies. And in remote areas, such as parts of Puglia in Italy and Epirus in Greece, cohesion policy is supporting a network of video cameras, wireless sensors networks, and drones for fire control. This will effectively patrol high danger and remotely located areas, giving early warning when fire starts. Fourth, the European Commission supports rebuilding after the fire. The European Union Solidarity Fund, quite well known, in particular, has supported member states to rebuild after wildlife disasters. However, this was only a fraction of the damage caused. The Solidarity Fund was conceived at a time of fewer fires and floods, and before we had a major public health emergency such as we did, COVID. To keep up with times, we must be ready to increase the size. This is an internal European issue, but we have got to increase the size, I think, of this pot. At the same time, we need to build back better. This means reforestation, rehabilitation of the soil, as well as recreation of biodiversity. I welcome and we follow innovative experiments such as those that have been developed in British Columbia, Canada, or here in Portugal, in Serra do Alvão, where wildlife prevention projects use other types of solutions like cows to forage in forests to reduce the propensity of fires, or building back better, developing the knowledge of the choices when replanting native trees and plants which are more resistant to forest fires. Fifth and last, the European Commission is also supporting coordination and the exchange of expertise. I already referred to this, but not just between member states, but also across the world. Throughout the expert group on forest fires, we are working to monitor trends and to coordinate responses across 43 countries, including not just European Union countries, but in particular those from the eastern and southern neighborhood. Two key elements of current work are common criteria for risk assessment and recommendations for fire risk reduction through landscape and forest management. Naturally, the European Commission is also supporting research. For example, in both Italy, I refer to CIMA and to S2IGI, and Portugal, REST Alvão, for instance, we are supporting the knowledge methods and computer models which will help predict both the risk of fires and their likely progression once they are started. This relies on research over time into the link between weather conditions such as temperature, humidity, sun intensity, airspeed, as well as data on the terrain. These models are particularly effective when combined with satellite mapping tools, which can produce real-time simulations. This kind of predictive modeling is an essential tool for an effective fight against forest fires. We are also helping the creation of a Latin American and Caribbean expert group on forest fires to exchange expertise, to exchange experiences, to exchange good practices with these countries. And this exchange of experience is one of the reasons why I am here today. At the European Commission, we are persuaded of the need and ready to mobilize our financial, analytical, and technical support to foster this exchange of experiences. But none of this will work without the experts and without the practitioners. In other words, we need you, your expertise, your experience, your proposals. So we welcome the Landscape Fire Governance Framework, and we'll be using it to inform our strategies and our funding. We may not be able to entirely eradicate wildlife fires, but collectively, we can certainly do a much better job at planning, preventing, and suppressing and minimizing its negative impacts. I am very grateful for the discussion today, and I look forward for the continuation of these exchanges in the future. So I thank you very, very much, and I wish you a very productive period of work together. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Elisa. It's very interesting to hear about those 5 topics, and in particular that the recognition that this tragedy in slow motion is no longer in slow motion, and that I was very interested to hear that the projects in Portugal about governance and helping to bring that together are going to be spread horizontally to places like the Czech Republic. Thank you very much for that. It gave us much to think about. I'd now like to invite Ortwin to present to us. He's presenting remotely.
Yeah, thank you very much, Peter, for your very kind introduction. I hope you can hear me well. And unfortunately, I'm not able to be with you physically, but I hope that I can still be in a good discussion with you on virtual ground. I would like to structure my talk into 3 major parts. The first part is a little bit on the issue of systemic risks. So those are the risks that we are talking about when we also refer to wildfires. Then I would like to delineate from that analysis of systemic risk, what are the governance requirements, and then to see how that really refers also to wildfire as a very good example for systemic risk governance. So let me first start about systemic risks. The word systemic risk has become very popular in the risk literature, but also in public debates. And it was popularized specifically during the financial crisis starting in 2008-9, when the whole financial system was at the edge of collapse. And then there was a lot of theoretical, but also practical reasoning about what that means to be systemic and how we can better prepare for systemic risks. And in the course of the discussion, it was already mentioned, the International Risk Governance Council in Switzerland had been very popular and also very present in the debate, developed a set of characteristics of systemic risks. And I think these characteristics are also very true for most of the risks that we are talking about here, specifically wildfire risks. And I would like to highlight 5 specific properties of systemic risks that also have direct connection to the way that they should be governed. And if I talk about risk governance, it's more than just risk management. Governance is really the whole set of rules, practices, but also safety cultures within a national or international system to deal, to regulate, to manage, and to recover in terms of dealing and coping with risks. Now, in terms of kind of governance that are necessary, some of the major requirements have already been echoed by Elisa's talk, and I'm very grateful that this was the first talk. But I would like to do it a little bit more systematically in a way that we talk about systemic risks. And there are a set 5 major characteristics that I would like to highlight. Number 1 is systemic risks are complex. And of course, that again is a fashionable word. It means that we have multiple causes, multiple consequences, and multiple intervening factors. That's the main aspect of complexity. They all interact, they have feedbacks, they may have nonlinear relationships. I get back to that. And so it is very difficult, even for scientists, to make very good predictions about what happens, also about what causes what, and what is basically only a moderator or an accelerator, and what is actually a cause. When we talk about wildfire, we can see that we have multiple causes, and that could be the forestry practices that we have, specifically monocultures. It is, of course, land use and land use management over the years. It is also sprawling of urban environments into wild areas. It is certainly urbanization, which is very similar to that. And lastly, which of course have been very prominent in the last 2 decades, climate change. But at the same time, we have a lot of complex consequences. So wildfires have consequences on ecology and on biodiversity. That's seemingly obvious. It has also major consequences in terms of economic losses, property losses, but also losses in terms of major resources that we need. It certainly has an impact on aggravating climate change because we are releasing CO2 in large amounts. It has impacts on human health, and it has impact, of course, on human well-being, as well as I said, on the ecological status of the affected countrysides. So in that sense, we have multiple causes, we have multiple consequences, and we have a lot of modifiers. So modifiers are in terms of what kinds of behavioral and what of kind of institutional, organizational capability there in order to deal with this. What is the stage of anticipatory management? All of those issues, specifically in the intervention of human beings into the wildlife, is one of the things that is a major modifier in all of this. And very often we're not quite sure how it works, in which way it really changes the cause-effect relationships. So that's my first part. It's the complexity, which makes it sometimes even difficult for scientists to deal with it and to define what is the best method to deal with wildfire. And we just seen the extent of wildfire damage that was already being said over the last 2 days, but also in the previous talk. The second major property is that those systemic risks are normally transboundary. They are very often intersectoral and transgressing political domains. And that's, I think, a very serious issue because we've used to deal with issues by domain. So we have ministries for health, we have ministries for economics, we have ministries maybe for environment. And in terms of forest fires, all of those ministries are affected. And cooperation between those ministries is absolutely essential in terms of regulation, but also in terms of management. We need to have community services, we need to have private actors, we need to have insurance companies, we need to have all kinds of NGOs a part of the management team, because that's a part of a transgressional risk. It's not able to limit that kind of risk to just one domain, either a policy domain or a geographic domain. Wildfires just go over the regions, over boundaries. They don't care about national boundaries. So in that sense, that's a very important second property. The third property is that many of those consequences are stochastic, meaning we're not quite sure what happens if things get worse. We see that, we have a lot of regular impacts that we can count on, but very often we have unseen impacts. We've seen that things develop in a way that we had not anticipated. So in that sense, the stochastic nature is, I think, a very important element to think about, and also needs to be somehow reflected by governance. The fourth thing is that wildfires, but a lot of other systemic risk, have tipping points. And tipping points are the ones that nothing happens until a specific threshold is being transpassed. And then the whole thing collapses. That was very true for the financial systems, very true for a lot of issues in climate change, but also for many other risks. And in forest fire, it's not so obvious, but very often we can see that, if you have high temperature and then it's just one match can, destroy a whole region. So in a sense, it's just the one little tip, that tipping point that make things going bizarre. And what I would really believe is that it's very important to think about these tipping points too, and to see how can we avoid reaching those tipping points and what we do in order to make sure that human behavior is not the main tipping point, which very often it is. The fifth and my last point that I would like to make in terms of risk characteristics is that there is a lot of ambiguity in systemic risks. And that's also true for wildfire. I mean, ecology needs wildfires. It's not that it is all bad. I mean, we're thinking about this, but very often, exactly for biodiversity, we need some wildfires, but only some, and they should be limited. The problem is that the way that we have done forestry in the last 150 years, and the way that we do land use management, those fires are getting exacerbated over time, and they get very pernicious even for ecology. But at the same time, to prevent all wildfires would also not be a good idea. That's one part of ambiguity. So it's not all bad and all good. The other thing is that we have very different actors involved in wildfires. There are communities, there are developers, there are economic businesses, there are insurances, there are political parties. All of them have sometimes very divergent views on what needs to be done and also how serious the threat is. And again, dealing with that ambiguity is a very important element, because very often we're getting paralyzed in politics because we have different actors that all want to do something, but they just impede each other. So we have a paralysis of politics, which you can see in many areas, and also, unfortunately, in wildfire management. So those are the five major systemic risk properties. First one is complexity. Second one is intersectoral trends, boundary impacts. The third one was stochastic relationships. The fourth one was existence of tipping points. And number five is the ambiguity. So what can we do about this? And that's my second part, is to really think about what is the kind of governance requirements. And what I'm saying is not totally new. Of course, most of you are familiar with it, but I think what I would like to do to make these kind of governance requirements a little bit more systematically related to these different properties. The first one, as I said, is complexity. And complexity, as I said, means that we have a hard time to define the root causes, the consequences, to quantify the type of impacts that we expect to happen, that we have a lot of modifiers in the game. And if that's the case, risk analysis may not be the best tool to deal with it. And what we suggest in those cases is to do better resilience analysis. So my first suggestion would be to do resilience-based governance. And resilience-based governance means to decrease the vulnerability. So meaning that whatever happens in terms of all the causes that could lead to wildfires, to make a forest more resilient against these kinds of causes. And that means, of course, different types of forestry. It also means maybe to look into making forestries not, as densely populated with trees as we have done that in the past, to be sure that there are natural barriers to fires to exceed into other areas. So all of that could be part of that resilience and more the prevention part of it, but also fast recovery is also something that is a part of resilience. And fast recovery means, do we have the means, if things start, that we can intervene very quickly? That's very important. Very often wildfires, if it takes too much time to intervene, then it gets, of course, worse, and then it becomes more and more difficult to do so. So resilience-based management and governance will be my first response to the increased complexity of the risk. The second one, intersectoral and transboundary impacts, really are requiring approach which I call collaborative governance. And collaborative governance means we need to have collaboration among the various governance or risk management agencies. And I told you already earlier that because of this transgressional nature of the risk, not just one domain is being affected. And what we can see all over the world is that forest management very often is done either by agricultural ministries or regulatory agencies or by environmental ones. But they also have strong impacts on the economy, a strong impact on human health. They have strong impacts on urban planning. And all of that needs to be included, because if we just don't include them, then things get worse because we are not seeing all those connections that have a major impact on the way that the risk actually materializes. So that's the second major element for me, collaborative, or as I said, I think Alicia said it before, integrative or integrative risk management and governance. When we talk about stochastic, that's the number three, we need also another approach, and which is normally called adaptive risk management. And adaptive risk management means that we observe what happens and have means available that are flexible in terms of what needs to be done. That's easily said. It's very difficult to do. We need adaptive organizational cultures that are not just doing their routines, which may be not very effective in many issues, that are willing to learn. Learning management is an important element there. And so adaptive means to see what's happening and to be flexible in response. Again, that's not an easy task, and it's, as I said, easily said than done, but it's very important because we can see that what works in one area doesn't work in another, and that works in one wildfire may not work well in another. So we need to be adaptive to all of the context conditions in which we operate. The fourth one is a tipping point issue. And as that tipping point, of course, is a very difficult element, because normally humans learn by trial and error. And so very often, if things work, we do the same thing all over again. That has been done very, very often in forestry because, nothing bad had happened and it worked economically. Now, with climate change coming at the same time, we see suddenly that we have increased the vulnerability quite a lot. So in order to avoid tipping point, what we need is an anticipatory governance. And anticipatory governance means we need to foresee those tipping points and do actions before those tipping points are actually reached. And very often in wildfire environments, the tipping point is human action. And to make sure that that human action at least is included in times when we have, a major natural propensity for wildfires. And again, I know that that's again easily said. We cannot have policemen at all places in the forest, but nevertheless, I think education as well as really good and strong penalties and sanctions if people do make campfires or something like that. Major education, school, all of that I think is necessary for this kind of anticipatory governance. And that leads me to my last point, that's ambiguity. As I said, we have, first, it's not quite clear what's always good in terms of ecology. And also we have multi-actors, and that I think is the main focus I would like to draw. Multi-actors always means that we have different interests or different values. We have very often also different types of knowledge that comes together, and preferences. All the four elements in which discourse takes place: knowledge, values, interests, and preferences. And they differ. They differ between all the various actors. They differ in terms of what are the priorities. They differ in what needs to be done. Some people believe more technical measures, others are more in back to nature, building back better, or being said by Alicia just a minute ago. There are all kinds of concepts that are competing with each other. However, I think what's very important is to say, well, if you want to be effective, competition is not a good recipe for good governance. We really need a collaborative means that made that already plausible to you. But I think in addition, we need what we call a participatory or polycentric risk governance structure. And that means that we need, before disaster strikes, to have those actors sitting around a round table and making sure first they understand the dimension of the problem. Very often, wildfires are still underestimated, and also in risk perception. We ask people in Germany or in other places, what are the big natural risks? Forest fires are not coming at the top. And so in that sense, I think we're underestimating it. So we need to make people aware of, also the stakeholders, aware of the risks that we have and that we face, and also the economic, health, and other kind of impacts that I was talking about. So that's the third thing. It's identifying a common problem definition, a common problem framing. And then also to find out a solution space we all can agree on. We don't need the solution. And that's, again, adaptive management. We don't have one solution. But we need a solution space. That means, how do we make sure that we have the capacity to have all those management skills, that we know that the resources are there, that the assets are there, that the trained personnel is there to deal with it. That we invest in anticipation rather than just in recovery. All of that are elements of where we need a kind of roundtable of all the actors, vertically, meaning from the community to the national level, even to the EU level or the international level, but also horizontally, between governments, between stakeholders, between local citizens. So all of them need to be involved to some extent, because, as I said, we need to have a common problem definition, and we need to define a solution space in which then we can operate, in which also the management agencies can operate without having to legitimize them all the time. So in my conclusion, what I would like to say is that the risk system, the systemic risk literature has quite a few things to offer. It's been developed not just on looking at wildfires, but on all kinds of systemic risks, technological, natural, behavioral, and others. And those 5 characteristics are true for many different types of risks. But it's also true for wildfires. And I think it's a very good application. And those 5 ones need to be addressed by governance. And I want to repeat them in the end again. It's complexity. It is intersectoral transboundary impacts. It's stochastic relationships. It's presence of tipping points, and the presence of ambiguity. And we do need then a combination, and I think that's the main point I would like to make. It's not just one governance style. It's actually 5 governance styles in parallel. We need to have a resilience-based governance, which is collaborative and integrative among various domains and agencies. It needs to follow the philosophy of adaptive, flexible management. It has to be anticipatory in order to avoid reaching tipping points. So investing in risk governance before actually the crisis occurs. And it needs to be participatory and polycentric. And I believe if we use these 5 major orientations towards governance, we will get better in our governance approaches, even if the context conditions unfortunately get worse due to climate change. Thank you very much.
Audun, thank you very much for that. Excuse me. Thank you very much for that. I think that was extraordinary. We've had two discussions, and this one I could see Mark Castelnau and some of his fire suppression colleagues nodding because they know about complexity, transboundary, stochastic tipping points and ambiguity, but then they were very happy, I'm sure, to hear about what the options, what we can do. We can look at resilience and collaboration, adaptation and so on. So thank you again very much. Might I also, on behalf of the audience, thank our speakers for not using a PowerPoint. It was very nice to be listening to somebody and not being distracted by fantastic visuals, but nonetheless. So thank you very much to Audun and to Elisa. Toddy, perhaps if I can ask you to reflect a bit on what you've heard. Sure. In the context of risk governance and your work in that area.
Absolutely. Thank you. Really, two great presentations. Thank you so much. And what struck me, one was the comprehensiveness of the EU framework that you were talking about, Minister, because and the approach that you're taking, and then also about Professor Wren and the framework that he is providing for us to think at a more intellectual level about risk governance. And so as I think about that, bringing those two things together, the framework that Professor Wren is suggesting to us, I think, is an organizing principle for how we do the work that you're suggesting, right? And that's what we need in order to get smarter faster. So what you're recommending is, Minister, is here are a set of programs that we can use to advance how we organize ourselves across the European Union. But in order for us to learn from that, I think what we really need to do is take a framework like what Professor Wren is suggesting, or the landscape governance framework, and then plug those actions into it so that we can actually accelerate our learning. And that is what I feel like the next step really is for us. So I think that's my first observation. The other thing that I would observe is that we are problem obsessed. Every time we get together to talk about these issues, we all start with a disaster. We're all just completely obsessed with telling ourselves about what the disasters are. And I think that what we need to do is become not even solutions obsessed, but alternative obsessed. Try to figure out what the alternatives out there are for us, much like what you're suggesting for us, Minister, and then really problem solving around those, like what is working and what is not working in those alternatives. And so I guess I would urge our entire community to move away from the problem framing that we all start with and move towards the alternative framing. I'll leave it there for right now, Peter.
Thank you, Tony. Tiago, you've introduced us to Audwin. You brought some of that thinking into the framework and the discussions, and of course your own research was part of that sort of process. Okay. What do you reflect on?
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Mrs. Elisa Ferreira, for all the support also that you have been giving us in these test pilots at the Northern, Central and South region in order to make the local communities or regional communities to be more engaged and more empowered to tackle the solution. They have the problem, they need to be them to solve the problem. Of course, there are European guidelines, of course, there are local and regional guidelines, but those are the communities that are more involved. And this is important to understand through also to Audwin Wren perspective, that we used to have a simple risk problem. And most of the nations that are here with us, they are facing simple risk problem where local solutions are being dealt with informal governance schemes. They do know how to solve all the problem, mainly non-development countries. They have the problem, they don't have this state organization that provide them some guidance. So they do know how to cope, they do know how to use fire. But we come a long way from this fire-driven culture or traditional use of fire, and we have been trapped in a firefighting trap, and the risk of fire has become more complex, as what Audwin was saying. So, and our politicians, when they are facing the threat of fire, they go to a shelf of solutions that they found a quick fix. A technological quick fix for a social economical problem does not fit. So I think this gap between what is needed to tackle a complex risk and what is needed to tackle a simple risk is very challenging. And our mental models, our institutions are not coping to address this evolution, for example. The Canadian director yesterday spoke and said, we are not coping to match the speed of change. Because the Canadian, I imagine, and I've been there, but it's a very well-staffed organization framed to solve by their own a problem of their own in a very direct perspective. It's a problem that is simple, addressed by a strong institutional leadership, very well staffed. But the problem evolved, and there are different perspectives now, imagine in Canada, but in other countries. So I think the transformation that all the societies are being fostered to do is to do nothing and just buy aerial resources and put some water on the ground, or to do a revolution in the way they are managing this risk. those two approach will not work. So, and the other solution is to increment the suppression resources or to put more money in this firefighting trap. But if we understand, I think if we are smart and there is a lot of knowledge available, we would engage in the transformation loop. We need to recognize that the environment has changed, and our past solutions can be adapted in a different mechanism, in a different approach where we change information and how we do the decision makings. And I think this is the critical issue. When Dr. Elisa Ferreira spoke about supporting a landscape fire governance framework that is available in the app, and it's the ultimate goal of this conference, I imagine that, okay, we need to find out a way to receive, for example, as what is happening in Sweden. Of course, the Swedish population is claiming for short silver bullets. And they know that they will fail if they only have silver bullets. And they are trying to innovate, building a different way to embed the decision-making capabilities, for example, in suppression. And they are going to pick up NATO standards. Why? If they have already a proven incident command system that works. So I think to share information, to share knowledge is really important to speed up the need to transformation of this action at the government level. So I think it's, to conclude, it's really important from our perspective, from our experience here in Portugal, that transversal interoperability, this multi-level, this capability to deal with different perspectives at the governance level, well-staffed with the technical capability, not to address the risk by a simple analytical perspective with the statistics, but with a trade-off analysis with the risk probability capability embedded in the staffing and to providing a good analytical framework to allow politicians to cope with uncertainty, because they don't like uncertainty, of course. But they need to deal with uncertainty and to live with it and lead their societies for a better place. So I think it's really challenging, your work, of course, but and ours as a technician is always challenging, because multi-objectives are being are on the scope of the incident command system when small communities are being a threat. At the same time as a natural park, you have two different goals with two different values, ambiguity that was speaking by Dortwin, and the incident command system, they need to have embedded capabilities to tackle both at the same time. Yeah. But this is a challenging for the incumbent power structures that like hierarchical and strong power command and control, which is not possible to deal this complexity under this hierarchical perspective. So it's very important also at the European level on the preventing and these public policy designs to deal with this silo culture that used to be very popular when the problem was simple and was framed as simple, but now it's complexity, so it's much more difficult to solve, and it's really needed, and it's really useful that we have the open-minded and humbleness to collect and to receive different experience in order to share to the others our own process. And I think we are trying to do this in Portugal, but it's really challenging, as you know, Peter.
I think we can all appreciate that it's very challenging. Ortwin, Tiago just mentioned and talked about the transformation, which is seeking to address that sort of collaboration issue. Do you have any thoughts or examples of success in institutions or agencies or organisations moving towards that collaboration and how they did that?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. It came to my mind, I don't know if you're familiar with this, Norio Okeda is a Japanese researcher on disasters, and he has developed what he calls disaster colleges. And they are being located in all these small towns in which disaster can happen, whether it's wildfire or whether it's an earthquake or something else. And the idea of these colleges is to get the local population involved. And I think the word empowerment was already mentioned before. To see, well, what can we do in order to anticipate what can happen and what can we do in advance to make this less severe? And also what can we do for fast recovery or even building better afterwards? And now they have a history around 20 to 30 years, those colleges. So they've been established, I think, 15 to 20 years ago. And they are fairly successful in several ways. One thing is it was very successful because they built local capacity. Secondly, they gave authority to people at locations. So it was really a polycentric, decentralized approach. But at the same time, these communities and through those colleges have familiarized themselves also with the scientific and more systematic knowledge about wildfires, about other types of natural disasters. So it was also a big learning experience. And finally, it was a very good consciousness raising aspect in which for the local community, but also then the larger communities got more interested in all of this. And then, of course, also more funds were allocated to this because they felt, well, this is fairly successful. This is just one example. I think we could learn from that example because very often it's important to see locally what can local people do and how can we get them together. And the idea of these colleges was also to give them higher esteem, higher reputation. It's not just education; it's really self-governance to a large extent. It includes not only the official agencies or official mayor and community leaders, but also just normal people who are in the neighborhood, and it seems to be that also very creative methods were being developed there in order to decrease the probability of wildfires and also to change kinds of human intervention, so like zoning and building codes and other kinds of things that were all affected by this. So this, I think, is a just one of a very good example where that kind of collaborative participatory process worked very well. And there's a little bit of literature in specifically in the Japanese literature, but also it's been written in English about the experiences. They were all positive. Some of them collapsed, some of these colleges, but most of them still survive, and they have been very powerful also in the economic development of these areas.
Okay, thank you very much, Alton. Yesterday, Dr. Judy Beck in one of the sessions, and I know from my own country that Indigenous people are looking for places and spaces to discuss, but also to be empowered. Toddy, Tiago mentioned we used to have a simple risk, which I think I remember when I first started in a simple organisation, which was a Commission of Forestry, but now we have a complex risk.
Yes.
Do you have any reflection on institutions and how they might adapt? Because being a forester and having been one for a very long time, I'm quite aware that my professional sector is not very flexible in the way it deals with things.
No, I think we have a lot of institutional rigidity. We don't have a shortage of that, right? I think, Tago, the way you identified it is that we've moved from a more simple risk framing to a more complex risk framing. And I think that's also what Professor Wren was getting at. Because at least in the United States, we used to have a wildfire that a large wildfire was 10,000 acres, and it was solely on U.S. Forest Service land. So you have one institution across a unified landscape, and there's no problem with that. And today, and again, this is in the United States, but it would not be limited solely to the United States, we have a wildfire that is anywhere from 250,000 acres to 1 million acres that covers multiple jurisdictions and involves the public, the private, the nonprofit sector, research entities, not to mention local, state, federal, and sometimes even international governments. So the complexity that Professor Wren was mentioning has been magnified enormously. Our institutions have not caught up with the complexity that we are now seeing in our natural systems. And because of the rigidities that we face, that makes everything much more challenging. But I think also, to your point, Tiago, we see a lot of innovation at the local level to deal with that complexity. But what we don't have are systematic approaches to harvest those lessons, to elevate them, and to learn more quickly from them. And that gets back to, I think, again, to your point, it was like if we have larger EU frameworks that are going to instigate and allow more creativity to emerge at the local level, then how do we learn from these informal systems and not overly orchestrate them so they become ossified and rigid as we continue to evolve and adapt? It is that interplay. The other thing that I would like to mention, I think that was really a very, very good observation, is that we have this tension between urgency to take action and the need to build more durable solutions. And those two things are in tension, but they are not in contradiction. And we have to learn to live with that ambiguity as well. How do we build those? How do we build these new institutions so that they actually are not always just responding to the most urgent thing, but actually responding to the longer-term risks that we are facing?
Okay, thank you, Tony. Elisa, that sounds like a conundrum that the European Union and in your ministry is dealing with, how to maintain sufficient structure and rigour to be consistent, but at the same time not to be ossified, as Tony said. What do you think?
Well, I think it was perfectly described. We have really to improve our capacity to control the problem. But as you mentioned in your first speech, I think at the same time we need to focus on solutions. And the solutions, they required a lot of complex approaches. And I noted from the different participants this complexity of the problem and the institutional rigidity that is behind. And I think this doesn't match. On the other hand, when we have this rigidity, always or often, it is the reflection of a kind of a safeguard in terms of who is responsible for what, and not running into areas in which you know that later on you'll be blamed because you have entered into spaces that were not your adequate field of work. So this is really in terms of governance. That's why I was commenting very positively on the topic. It's something that not only is difficult to access, but also it varies a lot from country to country. We are faced with this every day in the European Union because we have to respect the different administrative organizations that in democracy countries decide to have. And when it comes to finding solutions to development strategies or to problems like this one, which is part of a development strategy in the long term, how you develop, how you organize, how you create resilience in relation to financial problems, but also physical and climate problems. This requires, in fact, a multi-level approach. And how to manage this multi-level approach, leaving to each level. So it's the local level, but often we don't see at the local, or we don't find the capacities at the local level to develop what needs to be developed, whereas at the same time, when you have a very centralized kind of system, you don't listen to what is happening at the local level because you cannot afford to, and you don't know how to deal with these divergent approaches to different situations. So this is a general problem, in fact, to apply what we call subsidiarity principle in your administration. So do at a certain level what is better done at that level, but not to create silos in the different levels so that in fact you transit from one box to the next one easily and with humbleness And this is not easy. This is not easy. Another aspect that I'd like to touch upon is the fact that in a lot of areas, because urbanization in the whole world, but also in Europe, is becoming a bigger and bigger phenomenon, you more and more find places in the geography that are empty of young people, empty of institutional capacity, empty of the energy to address in a reasoned and informed way the problems that you have to face. So more and more, and this is why rebalancing and cohesion, rebalancing growth, keeping capacity and keeping institutional capacity outside the big conurbations is not only essential for the sustainability of these conurbations, because after a while these economies of scale overcome the potential economies of scale and you have congestion problems, but also the emptiness of a lot of territories is an ingredient, one of the other ingredients that really sometimes prevents that at the regional or local level you have still the capacity to react, to prepare, to think, to propose, recognizing that one size never fits all. And in fact, that you cannot at the central level do the recipe, the bullet, the silver bullet that will solve everything everywhere. So having this chain of multi-level competencies is something that we really have to develop for all these reasons. If you are talking about health structures and if you are talking about education, if you are talking about innovation, if you are talking about capacity to address problems like this, of course you cannot ignore this. And the multi-sectoral approach, of course, requires a right level for you to interact and for you to decide what is the common rule. It ends up, and I finish, with a call for a culture of prevention, because when we put, certain targets as a kind of a broad cultural policy priorities for the development of the world and of the countries and of the regions and of the localities, then you really solve by this interpretation, different interpretations of the same target, you immediately start solving a lot of issues. But culture is something that only changes with a lot of effort and time and a lot of actors engaged. But I think it's a cultural problem which doesn't simplify, I recognize, the description of the problem, but it can create a kind of common layer for solving a lot of questions and framing a lot of private and institutional or personal options. But this is something that we all have to work upon.
And Tiago, Elisa just mentioned the subsidiarity, and Ortwin mentioned collaboration, which is a subsidiarity is sort of which level is the most appropriate for something to be done or talked about, discussed, and then collaboration is sideways. When you reflect on those two things, because Portugal at the moment is probably the wildfire-affected country that is the most thinking about these things, and it'd be good to know how you think those things are going. I realise that it was 2017, and that's not very long ago. In terms of, Elisa was just talking about culture. I'm a forester. As far as I can tell, our culture hasn't changed for many, many, many decades. So how is that sort of subsidiarity and collaboration playing out as you try and work through it?
Thank you for the question. Well, I think the most critical issue here in this dealing with this complexity is when you drill down and go local, the problems get more simple, but then you realize that there are no persons there. The social capital has been eroded to a level that does not allow a fair discussion, rationalized discussion, because fire is very passionate. And that is why it's so important to invest in dealing with the causes only and not tackle the consequence. Of course, it's important to have air plans and suppression resources, but if you just stick with that, we will lose. Suppression is a cost, and it can't be a sunk cost. It's the cost. But prevention is an investment. And everybody here, I think, came from a forestry background, so they understand they are feeding the cow for future revenues when you are doing full treatments, when you are doing managerial capabilities at the local level. So I think this Green Deal perspective at the European level, it's a great opportunity to allow people to go at your interior areas and have green jobs, doing forestry, doing being shepherds. But those activities need to be recognized as social value, because you don't want to live with a person that smells a goat, okay? But you only smell a goat because you are a shepherd, but that smell does not attract a good companion. So you need to be pay a good salary for the persons to live in the rural areas and have a decent life. So I think this institutional economics, in the words of Eleanor Olmstrom, it's really important to cope with this complexity because it's a social, ecological, economical system. And if this frame to dealing with the causes instead of only dealing with the consequences, I think we are on the right direction. And subsidiarity in Portugal, it works, but it's still very rooted in old-fashioned style culture. Okay, we need to do something because fire season will come. No, you need to work, focus on the causes 365 days per year, investing in forestry, investing in agroforestry. Look at Alentejo, southern part of Portugal. It's fire prone. It does not burn as well as the northern part because it's grazed. And here, the agriculture public common policy works because it subsidizes the sheep, the goats, the cows that consume the grasses and does not allow the shrubs to go up. And this technical innovation has proven long in different types of biota, it works. And if you had fire, good fire during the winter, we are in the growth process to work that. But I think it is important just to finish the media role here, the capability to communicate these public policies to different type of audience. And in this type of social connectivity, and in this such challenging democracy policy regimes to cope with this uncertainty and these threats, it's really important that we bring for the media into the problem because they have a relevant role. And let's regard it and face a good example of COVID. Without authoritarianism, without a dictatorial regime, European or Northern or Western societies, they were capable to manage that emergency. And I think we can do that in fire if we tackle with the causes, not with the consequence. And I think subsidiarity holds on this principle. You are accountable if you manage the resource at the local level, and you can share your experience and bring a more cohesiveness society with a good social capital. But everything goes to the pocket of the person that lives in the grounds. And we need to put public policies, the forestry asymmetric bargaining claims from the companies, from the owners of the properties, in order to don't mismanagement and confuse the shareholders with the stakeholders. I think that is an important issue.
I think that's probably a very general statement.
Yeah, it is.
And not just to us. Orvan, Tiago just talked about how to get those things, subsidiarity, organised, etc. It seems to me that relates a little bit to the tipping point question, as in how do you maintain that anticipatory governance to avoid the tipping point or know when it's coming? How does that reflect into what Tiago was just discussing?
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. I think that, there are two aspects that we need to really take into account. The one thing is that we try to learn by trial and error. And what we can see here, I think that forestry management and forestry cultures have already changed basically to the better. So that, we have now more mixed cultures and so on. At the same time, climate change got worse, so that people don't see immediately that things are getting better. So what we can see very often, also political debates, that people say, why do we put all this investment into changing of the forest? It doesn't work because actually the forest fires are getting worse and getting more spread out than we had experienced before. And that, I think, is a very problematic issue in terms of public communication, because we need public support for building up the capacity. So that's one point, and I think there's need a better information communication strategy to say, look, guys, climate change is going to happen. I mean, we are unfortunately not um, in the position that we can really stop it at this point. We should do it, but it takes time, and we have to adapt. There's no other way. And we're already on the way of adaptation, but again, it's not something in which we can see the success immediately. I think that's one of the points that we need to communicate, because otherwise people are getting very frustrated. The other point is, and I think it was mentioned several times also by Alicia just a minute ago, it's not that we can rely only on the community level, because very often, as I said, if it is being transsectoral, if it's transboundary, we need to go up the vertical governance level and make sure that those are aligned. And there are some routines that are very helpful, and I think Lisa pointed out that, for institutional response, you need also routines. You cannot always be flexible, because then it's also not predictable, and then we have a big problem of making things really contingent. So it's always a fine line between being adaptive and also developing good routines. I think the best thing to do that is really to train people on the local level. What are the objectives? What are the means that we can have at the time? What are the options? And then let them decide separately, in a case of emergency, what is best to do in that specific context. So there needs to be an interaction between these various levels, also to set the boundaries, what can be tolerated, what should not be tolerated, to see if where technological progress is there, that's actually going to be applied. Also new cultural techniques in terms of forestry. All of that are very important elements, I think, that also needs to be transferred to the various actors. And last and third point, and mentioned that before, we're talking about different interests, different power constituencies and so on. It's very important to get them online before actually things happen. That's also avoiding tipping points, so that we can see that there is a concerted effort to prevent something rather than a concerted effort to recover, which is always good, but then often too late to get all the actors together.
Thank you very much. Well, now perhaps we've had quite a number of questions, as you can imagine, on this topic coming in, and so I'll start to pose some of those to the panel. Where are we? The question that came in for you, Elisa, which is related to the role that academia might be able to play in strengthening the things we're talking about. What sort of things can academics do, can research do, that would help to support and strengthen this sort of risk governance approach? I mean, we have some academics here, of course, that are demonstrating that, but do you have any thoughts?
Well, I think there is a lot of expectation on what can come from the academy. I think the academy is probably one of the sectors of society in which you have the capacity to develop complex approaches to complex problems, because you have this possibility to bring in a lot of experts, and I think it goes from experts that can work on very, very specific solutions. And I would, of course, the technique of forest watching or controlling through drones, through very sophisticated techniques, satellite techniques, whatever, to the research on what are the right species, or what are the right quality of goats that can survive in a certain area, to what kind of management of water resources and how you do it. So very, very specific issues that really touch upon connection between different sectors, and more research is going into that direction. Now, what you see textiles, and you have medicine or satellite development using textiles, because the interconnection between different knowledges is really at the core. So, in fact, here you must combine different capabilities, being veterinarian or plant experts into artificial intelligence or digital capabilities. So there is this dimension. There is the other dimension of the social economic aspect that interacts completely with this. When we were talking about how, if you have areas of Europe that are empty of people because there are no people there, and ones that remain, they are the ones that didn't have the energy or the hope that their life that it was not worth for them to move away from the place where they were born. But they are in a very negative, sometimes they are very weak, sometimes they feel very isolated. We are also in cohesion policy doing some research on brain drain, for instance, and brain drain is a phenomenon. And this, for a long time, the economists, and I'm an economist, so I'm free to speak about it, we are expecting that some sort of invisible hand, that was the mainstream, would just rebalance growth. It didn't happen, it is not happening. So lots and lots of spaces, sometimes it's forest, sometimes it's agricultural land, is becoming absolutely empty of people. And ones that remain, they become a bit bitter, because they feel that they have been forgotten. They feel, and there is a lot of research on that as well, which is also research, and it is important. So research and some very important papers have been published, like the geography of discontent and what impact this has in the vote of people, in their political choices, because they become against the system. System forgets me, I'm against the system. And that is interpreted in all possible ways, and we see it across the world. So the ones that feel that globalization, digitalization is not for them anymore. They cannot cope with it. They cannot interact with it. They have no influence in that. This is very important for our societies. So rebalancing, thinking that you need a policy to rebalance, because otherwise the individual options of the different people and companies doesn't necessarily bring in rebalancing. It brings the opposite, until as a community we break up. And this is a real danger. And this has a lot of connection with what we are discussing. Because in fact, when we won't at the local level, and Tiago was mentioning in a very precise way, if we don't organize our system, our sticks and carrots, economic, in the sense that if you decide to remain, that you have some income from managing your forest, that you have some income from having goats or sheep or whatever that help you to manage the forest. If we don't have this stimulus, of course, you are abandoned in a way. This is the kind of issues that also requires research from people from sociology, from people from human geography, from economists, and it is important that also politicians and policymakers listen and are interested. When we talk about spreading this kind of philosophy, when I was trying to bring in what we can call culture, yes, you have got to have also another aspect of research, that is how to create the mechanisms that in which you share with the community, with society, what you think should be shared. And it brings in communication, of course. It brings in also the capacity from people from academia to come down from just publishing papers for the academic career, but trying to address and to interact with solving problems and not only concentrating on describing them or saying what solutions, perfect solutions, that are not possible. Let's work on constraints that impede that the perfect world is then, that we often see in academia and in papers, goes into the real life of people. Let's concentrate research on that. What is missing for something that under our perfect assumptions would be perfect? What is the non-perfect assumptions that impede you to address it? So let's make also the academy more humble and more capable of being proud for being able to solve problems and not necessarily just to be published in one extra international magazine or book, even if that is very helpful for the academic career. So bring the humbleness also to the academia and the interchange, because we need all the brains together to solve this problem. It's a problem of survival, so let's concentrate on what matters. And as women, I think we share a lot of this problem-solving kind of approach. Not that men can't do it, but often they get a bit distracted in the way.
I think that's very, very correct.
Sorry about that.
Completely. Elisa was just talking about some of the research and academic things. Somebody's asked Toddy about good examples of cross-sectoral work across government agencies.
Good examples of cross-sectoral work across government agencies. Yeah. Well, I was thinking about this earlier, both when Ortrin and Tiago were talking, that where do we have examples in the academic scholarship or elsewhere of where we have addressed the same kind of characteristics that Ortrin laid out for us? And I started to think about areas like water governance. We've had to manage water for a long time. So in comparison, the wildfire problem is relatively new. It's, wildfire has been around for a long time, but the extremity of the challenge we face is within the last 20 to 30 years. We have other examples of natural resource management or other kinds of management where we have a stronger institutional or governance capacity around it. And I think water governance is one of those areas. We've had to manage our watersheds for a long time, and you have the same sort of scaled efforts, polycentric, multi-level challenges there as you do in wildfire. I think biodiversity conservation is another area where we've had to be managing this, and we have larger global institutions that help us manage biodiversity conservation. And of course, climate change, right? The first Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change started in 1990. That was the very first report. So that goes back about 30 years, and we have long-term institutions that have been doing that kind of work for some time. So if we think about the parallels, and I don't know if the person who asked the question was thinking about larger governance institutions, but those are the ones that occur to me. I think that we have some really creative solutions that are coming forward in a variety of different places. Portugal really stands out to me as a place where there's an enormous amount of innovation taking place, and I think understanding that ecosystem that gives rise to that innovation is really important. I think we see some very exciting things happening in Australia and Canada as well. The thing I'll point to, though, is we are overrepresented in examples from the Northern Hemisphere in general, and we don't have enough examples from the African continent, from China, from Russia, and I think those are areas where we actually need more research and more examples, and the Global South to come forward, because we are missing, I think, a lot of innovation that is actually taking place in those areas.
Certainly in some of the presentations that have been done here, there was an example, I think it was yesterday, from Mozambique, and the way it was being done was fantastic. And if we just pick that up,
Yes.
and and reworked it to fit it into Algeria or into France or Spain or Greece, it would be a fantastic thing. So I think that north-south connection is phenomenal and really important. Ortwin, somebody's asked a question about the sort of professions and skills that we need to sort of look at or encourage. I keep rabbiting on about being a forester, but what other things, what do we need from your perspective as someone who's studied governance extensively? What sort of skills and competencies and what sort of professions, I guess, and training should we be encouraging?
Yeah, I think that's a very important issue. I mean, we need interdisciplinary cooperation. I think that was stressed several times, and that includes social scientists, natural scientists, technology experts. But we also need people that can build those bridges. You know, we sometimes call this transdisciplinary science, so that we can also tap into other types of knowledge. And some of the indigenous knowledge that was just mentioned, I think sometimes can give us very good kind of feedback on what has worked in the past. It doesn't always mean it works in the future, because also the context conditions have dramatically changed, climate change or population growth or other things. But nevertheless, I think very often traditional means are something that we need to include in order to make better solutions for the future. So my view is that what we really do need are some people who can build bridges. And that means maybe people that are very good in complexity science. That sounds very abstract, but it can be very concrete in a way that it's being transferred into a solution making that Alicia just mentioned. The other thing I think is we need very good people that have excellent, what I call catalytic skills, that can bring people together, that know what kind of architecture in terms of communication and negotiation work in order to make progress. Facilitating processes, being a good moderator in all of this, making sure that evidence-based knowledge is part of the policy-making process, how to deal with conflicting goals, values, preferences, interests, and so on. So that, I think, is also a very important skill that we all need in order to progress. And finally, I think we also need cultural anthropologists who are giving us a better understanding about the cultural background in which all of that happens. Very often we can see that, you know, communities have a long tradition with forestry, and we come in as an outsider and then trying to tell them what to do, which normally doesn't work very well. And so in that sense, it's good to also know a little bit about the cultural background in which all of that happens, how the context has changed over time, and what that means in terms of management requirements. So I think, yes, it's a very wide and expensive approach, but I still believe that those kind of bridging requirements are the ones that I would see as the most important ones in terms of dealing with this complex issue.
Okay, thank you, Ortwin. We have about 10 minutes left or so. There's a question somebody's asked which I think is really interesting and can bring some of this together, and I'll put it to each of the four of you, if I may. And it's the idea of creating a solution space for risk governance. How would we do that? What are the main pillars of supporting that sort of a space? A lot of what Elisa's talked about, and you, Tiago, reflecting on Portugal, and Tony and Ortwin, has been about giving people time and space to engage. Now at the local level, as you mentioned, Tiago, when you go down, it becomes simple enough that you can see all the actors and over time understand them relatively quickly. But the moment you go up, all the thing becomes more complicated. So how can we look at creating that solution space or a discussion space? Elisa, perhaps.
Well, I think we have during this discussion we have really addressed several angles of this. But again, I think it's a matter. It relates a lot to a matter of recognizing, because in fact you can have the best structure at the local level. I mean, even admitting that you have the right people and the right competencies at the local level, but there are certain circumstances under which they cannot solve the problem because the problem is bigger than what they can manage, because they don't have the means, because they don't know what to do. And we are talking about big global phenomena. So at the same time, you need to have, at the other levels, the other layers, you have to have the capacity to be able to understand and to decide. And we are talking about a diversity of circumstances, so it's not an easy job. So this is, for me, the kind of aspect that we need to address. Coming back to our previous question, if I can, just a small detail. But I think, particularly in Europe, I don't know how generalized this syndrome is, but in Europe you have also another aspect of what we can include in culture, because culture is too broad, that is related to the skills. Progressively, we have, in fact, this difficulty in recognizing intermediate skills. So all the research institutes want to become universities. You need polytechnics. You need a more closer approach to the problem, so that if you have the competencies, you also have the solutions. But also in terms of young people, when they decide what they are going to do. What Tiago was saying is very important. Are you going to be a blue collar? Are you going to be a shepherd? What can you exceed in society? What is recognition of society in relation to these kind of jobs? You are managing a forest. What is recognition of society? How are you valued socially? And in fact, you see that we need skills in Europe, and at the same time, we have a mismatch between the supply and demand of the adequate skills. So this is also a matter for reflection, how you evaluate, how you address in fact, the practical knowledge, and how researchers and practitioners, what is the attitude of researchers when you understand that there are problems, probably there are solutions that are being implemented all over the world on which we could really learn, that we could understand better, develop, and then share them. So sharing and understanding how problems can be solved is in itself also a way to inspire solutions for a problem where definitely one size doesn't fit all. But in fact, I think that case by case, we need to share good experiences, to transmit them to the people. And also, I mentioned very briefly, cooperation across countries in Europe, particularly financed and supported by Interreg, has built a lot of good practices on which you see that even different jurisdictions with different legal bases, they manage to solve and to organize a structure that is then, it's required that this structure is recognized centrally, so that in fact they have a response if they need it. But the minimum local level can really give us good examples, and I think more than anything, it's on good examples that we can get inspiration for good solutions, provided we are humble enough to listen to them and to be willing to develop them.
So appropriate skills and the dialogue of knowledge. Toddy.
So I would say that I've got a couple of ideas here. I think, first of all, we need to create awareness about the need and the opportunity for governance level. And I think this conference is an amazing step forward. I mean, when was the last time I attended a conference that was focused on governance? I can't even begin to tell you, especially as it relates to wildfires. So I think creating awareness about the need and the opportunity is the first thing we need to do, and continue to do that. I think then we need to identify and recruit champions who are going to be the spokespeople for promoting this at the country level, the regional level, in terms of moving us forward, and who are going to be the people that are going to take the leading roles for moving that solution space forward. The third thing is that we need to recruit specialists who, and these could be scientists, they could be managers, they could be indigenous peoples, who are going to help us create and determine the impacts and the indicators that need to be addressed. And I think we've got we've started to do that with the current document. And then we need to test those indicators and metrics broadly, harvest that experience, and then bring it back. But we need a more systematic, we need a system for governing ourselves, and I think at least that's, at least off the top of my head, 5 steps that we could take.
Okay. Thank you, Toddy. 5 steps. Ortwin, you had 5 and 5. What do you think about creating a space that people can discuss?
Yeah, thank you. I would certainly endorse that idea. I think one thing that I would like to stress, I think was already mentioned, is that we have mutual respect for anybody who is part of that governance systems. I think very often we can see, humility was mentioned several times, that either academics or sometimes politicians have a disrespect for those who have a lot of experience with wildfires. So I think it's very important to respect each other from the beginning and to listen to those who have already experienced. So to bring together systematic knowledge from the sciences, to have anecdotal but also experiential knowledge from those who have been, exposed to wildfires for a long period of time, and those who, in some sense, are either suffering or are benefiting. I mean, also those may be curing. So I think it's very important to get that kind of a discourse going on with, respecting each other, trying to listen to each other, but then having a very clear goal of defining a solution space. And I think that's not just talking to each other, it's not enough. There needs to be a product at the end, and I think if that is well and professionally moderated, that is possible.
Thank you very much. So Tiago, skills, knowledge, dialogue, space,
Thank
feedback.
you. Yeah. Well, most of you here are part of a fire community that was trained and was that grow with intent to protect forests and also lives, but forests. And I think it's important that this framework that we are going forward with it's the claim that we are capable as a wildfire community to be ready to help and to be part of this dialogue, of this challenge that happens bottom up, of course, and helps to change the management and to speed up the transformation process at the organizational level, at the policy level. But I think we need to tune the government systems in order to share value at the local level. We all know here, from South Africa to Sweden to California to New Zealand, that if forests are protected, if they are esteemed and if they are loved and if the value they produce is shared at the local level, at the local communities. So the informal system in the 60s in Portugal was based on this trust relation. The forests are there because I need to farm my land, I need the fertilizers, natural fertilizers that goes inside, so I will not allow that forest to get burned because I won't have fertilizers to grow up my potatoes, for example. And this relation was completely destroyed with this global economy. And I think it's important that we recognize that we are in the vicious circles on climate change or global warming, but it's a global economical issue here. And the public policies at the European level and also need to tackle this issue because global economy can't take us apart, quoting Joy Division. But it's this accumulation, massive accumulation of capital at the financial level need to be transferred for local owners, for local shareholders of the problem also. And once we were fighting fires 30 years ago, I was fighting fire with the Chilean, and after constructing a fire line, we just close the release of our boots, take our casket off and say, why are we putting our life in danger for the cause of the forest? And he replies, well, I need this forest because I need to have an income to put my kid at the school. And I know that this tree will provide the pencil for him to learn how to write. Of course. It's so simple. That's why it's important that we need to tune this governance system, and I think this is the purpose of the landscape fire governance scheme. It's to bring smarter policies, fire-adaptive policies, to tune the system to provide and share value at the local level. if you do that, I think we are in the right place.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all of our speakers, to Elisa Ferreira, the European Commissioner, for cohesion and reforms. I'm very interested in that. Dr. Ortwin Wren, who helped us with the theoretical risk and some very important points. Dr. Toddy Steelman from the US reflected on that, and of course Tiago. I'd like to ask you to thank all of our speakers this morning who've started us off on a rich discussion on governance and fire risk governance. Thank you very much.